The Audi TT RS is a sweet car, and it can go from 0 to 100 in just 3.7 seconds, way faster than I expected at least. But its body kit from an aerodynamics point of view has some good points, but is pretty bad overall. And I feel bad for saying that because one of your amigos, George, commissioned us to simulate his car. It's the truth though. As we'll see, there are two major flaws and one minor one. But the good news is that we'll also cover some easy ways to fix these flaws. So George, sorry dude, but hopefully these fixes will make up for it. And if you'd like us to simulate your very own car, let us know here. So we ran this car at 72 kph, which is the typical speed we simulate cars at. That's because it's about the point where a car's drag becomes the dominant resistive force. And that speed I thought was actually the problem, but we'll get to that later on. So anyway, let's get into what this body kit is, what's good with it, and what's bad with it. The Audi RS TT has some sweet additions. It has a cool front splitter, a diffuser with strakes, a large rear wing with swan neck supports. They're really cool. They're those supports that wrap over the top of the wing. And my favorite, this vent in the hood. For those interested, we actually did the regular Audi here a while back. This is the improved version, the RS. And despite the weaknesses of the body kit, which we'll cover later on, it is still an improvement. So for example, the lift produced with this version dropped from 5.6 kilos to 3.3, so it's a nice little drop. But on the other hand, the drag coefficient increased from 0.32 to 0.34. And that's to be expected because usually when you cut down on the lift produced, the drag will increase. Let's cover the body kit parts and their locations and the effects on the global and local aerodynamics. First of all, the front splitter. This is the center plane colored in the velocity in meters per second. Zooming into the front, if you've watched some of our other videos, you'll know exactly what I'm going to say here. So, the flow separates underneath the splitter, and that's really bad. That's because we now have a wake underneath, and looking at the drag orbit, that comes with a sliver of very high drag production too. So we're getting more drag from this splitter. And this flow separation is one of the worst I've seen, but it's not actually completely the splitter's fault. So the splitter is definitely too sharp and not extended forward enough. You can have one or the other, either sharp or short, but not both. Having both like we have here, where the splitter is only a couple inches long and very sharp, means that the flow that's traveling around the edge is highly angled to the splitter's edge. And because the splitter isn't rounded at the front, the flow just separates. That's bad. If you extend the splitter forward more, you can see that the flow is straighter up here. That's because it isn't affected by the front of the Audi much. The reason why the flow here, close to the Audi, is curving so much is because it's slamming into the front of the Audi and then being forced to turn and flow elsewhere. So the best fix is to extend the splitter forwards. That would make the front edge of the splitter slice through the straight flow upstream cleanly. But as I mentioned, this wake isn't just a splitter's doing. This wake is so large also because some flow can go through the front of the Audi. What happens is the flow comes along and some flow goes through this opening and then downwards underneath the car. That makes this wake under the splitter larger because if you don't have this flow from above coming down, there'd be more room here for the flow underneath to go up. And because you're shoving all this flow underneath the car, that would then naturally force that flow up and reattach to the top of the splitter earlier. So while this additional flow entering above and flowing down doesn't cause a flow separation over the splitter to begin with, it definitely makes it larger because the flow can't reattach as quickly as it usually would. Despite that, if I were to do anything in this region, I wouldn't actually close off the front. That's because I think that it would arguably make the car worse. And to understand why, let's look at this front and think about what's happening. So we know that the flow over the splitter is highly angled to begin with. That's because of all this flow at the front of the Audi slamming into it and having to redirect. If we close this little slot here, that will just cause more flow to do the same. So the flow over the splitter will be even more angled, and that's not even the worst bit. While this wake under the splitter is bad, the flow hitting the front of the Audi and decelerating is worse. That's because you're dumping so much of the flow's kinetic energy into it and wasting it. That's even more drag. So closing this little slot will make it even worse and you're going to waste more kinetic energy. So there'll be more drag from that. So don't close the slot, and in fact, I wouldn't even extend the splitter forward either. That's probably because it's a little complicated. The easiest way to fix here would actually be to round the underneath. You'd have to attach additional material, maybe carbon fiber, and then the best shape would literally be taking a symmetric airfoil and thick one, like a NACA 0020, and slicing it down the middle, then sticking the underneath into here. That would make a minimal difference to the appearance of the car, but still give the float a much better surface to flow around. Now, despite this splitter being bad from a drag point of view, from a downforce point of view, it's actually very good. This pressure plot shows just how much low pressure is produced, and there's minimal high pressure. So from a downforce point of view, this splitter is very good. It's just coming at a high price. That's the splitter. This car also comes with a hood vent. This is there to exhaust some of the flow over the hood from the engine bay. We modeled this as the speed that the flow enters the front vent. That's the flow coming out of the vent in the hood. This may or may not be the speed that happens in real life, however, we don't have any information about that, so this is just a general value. Now, I think this vent is pretty good. If you look closely, it seems like the boundary layer just after it might be a little thinner. It's tough to tell, but at the very least, we can conclude that with this exit flow speed specified, the flow over the hood isn't disturbed too much, and possibly not at all. So while that means that the hood flow isn't being improved here, it isn't being made any worse. And if you have another way for the flow in the front to exit from, that also helps reduce the cooling drag a little, as long as the piping isn't too windy. Anyway, let's move to the diffuser because it's supposed to be better, but it's not. It's pretty bad. So to begin with, the diffuser features strakes. Now I'm not sure the exact reason why Audi decided to put them on here. Usually strakes are added to straighten the flow over the diffuser and isolate each region from the rest of the flow. For example, behind the rear wheel, you get a wake. If you don't have strakes here, the wake will then meander around and bleed into other regions too. That's bad for a diffuser because you want to have clean flow over it. The better the flow is going over it, the better it can perform. One major reason is because if you have slow moving flow going over the diffuser, like you have from the wake of the rear wheel, that means that the flow doesn't have as much energy, so it's likely to separate. But adding strakes, you reduce that tendency. Audi added strakes onto the diffuser, and it looks good, but the diffuser isn't very good still. So the flow is obviously separating here. You can see that the flow speed is really low behind it, and it's also angled down. If the flow stayed attached over the diffuser in this plane, then the flow should be faster and it should be kicked up more. If it did that, then downforce would be produced and the drag would drop. To look at this further, we have this snapshot from behind and looking just up a little. This plane is in between two strakes that are very close together, and after I saw this, I thought that maybe that was just a bad region. If you have two strakes right next to each other, maybe the boundary layers were growing around them quite quickly and enough to stifle the flow through them. Or maybe having the strakes so close to them would kind of choke the flow in this region. So I took this snapshot, which is 15 centimeters to the left, and now between two strakes which are spaced very far apart. We still get the same problem here. So it seems like this diffuser is just doing poorly across its width. The strakes aren't the problem, it's the diffuser. So why is this diffuser performing so poorly then? Why is there this wholesale separation going on? Well, I think it's just too curved. Looking underneath, you can see how curved it is. The flow doesn't have enough energy to get around that curve, so it separates. And that gave me an idea. If the flow didn't have enough energy at this 72 kph speed, then maybe at a faster speed, it would have enough energy to get around that curve without separating. So I did a quick simulation of this exact setup, but now at twice the speed, 144 kph. We still get the exact same problem though. The flow over the diffuser is just bad. And that tells us a couple things. The first is that the speed isn't the problem. This body kit, at least the diffuser, doesn't perform any better at higher speeds than lower speeds. The second is that the only real way of fixing this easily is probably to use something like vortex generators. The idea is that you place vortex generators just ahead of the point where the flow separates from. Here is about where the diffuser starts. That will then churn the flow up close to the surface in the boundary layer and give the flow close to the surface more energy to stay attached. And I just want to note that this idea of using vortex generators over the diffuser isn't mine. There are actually a few cars out there doing that now, but from what I know, the first person to have this idea was someone who I actually worked with. I'll just say his first name, Piros. I won't say which OEM he's working at now. He hasn't told me that. He's okay me telling him that. But this was his idea back in like 2015. Now, while vortex generators will really help keep the flow attached, and as a result, the wake will be smaller and the drag will be lower, vortex generators produce a little bit of drag themselves. It's not a big deal, but it's something. If you want to reduce the drag too, then you could use something called micro vortex generators. As a rule of thumb, their height is about 1/3 of the height of the boundary layer. They still give most of the effect, but without any of the pressure drag addition. So here, looking at the boundary layer at 72 kph, I'd say vortex generators of about 1.5 centimeters in height would suffice. Also make them counter-rotating because they're usually more effective. Finally, if we look at the pressure plot, things get even more alarming. Not only is the flow separating over the diffuser and creating a larger wake, but we also get pretty high pressure underneath. That's terrible for downforce production. In fact, with all this high pressure pushing upwards, the diffuser might even be producing lift, the opposite of what it should be doing. So this really needs to be fixed. If nothing else were done to the car, and only this was corrected, that would be a big win. Let's now move to the rear wing. It's really impressive. There are some good points about it. Perhaps my favorite is that it uses end plates. Anytime a lifting surface like a wing uses end plates, that greatly reduces how much the tip vortices can roll up, and that then reduces the induced drag. So that's great. But in the center plane, it's pretty obvious that the wing isn't performing that well. There is a very large wake underneath it. So the flow is separating over it and it's partially stalling. Let's look at the pressure plot to see what kind of forces are being produced. The good news is that the pressure on top is very high and the pressure underneath is very low. So we have a pressure difference here and hence downforce is being produced. And that's the thing, just because a wing is stalling doesn't mean it's not producing downforce or lift. It's entirely possible to have a wing stalling but still produce a decent downforce. It might not be the most it can produce, but it's still decent. That's effectively what we have here. The bad part comes from the additional drag you get. So while you might still produce downforce, you produce a lot more drag too. So it's now costing you more to produce about the same amount of downforce or even less. So why does this happen? Well, fortunately for me, my PhD was actually in wing aerodynamics. The main reason why there is so much separation over the underside is that this wing is pretty thin. It has about a 12% thickness to chord ratio, which while it's not super thin, it can present problems, particularly when it's at low Reynolds numbers and on highly cambered wings. Here we have both. Given the flow speed hitting the rear wing, the Reynolds number is only about 200,000. What that means is that the viscosity is relatively high and will do a decent job sucking energy out of the flow. The higher the Reynolds number is, the less effective the viscosity is at doing that. Also, this wing is highly cambered, so it's bent quite a lot. But why are all these things bad? Well, wings, and in particular thin wings, are very sensitive to the flow speed. The faster the flow speed is, the more the flow will remain attached. At a Reynolds number of 200,000, that's pretty low, and we're in the region where the flow is very sensitive to the geometry now. Then on top of that, adding all the curvature from the camber just makes it even more difficult for the flow to turn around that underside and remain attached. So to solve that and keep the flow attached more, there are a few options. The first is to make the wing longer. That will help the flow become more turbulent and stay attached. But here that won't really work because if you simply make the wing longer and somehow keep the camber and maximum thickness in the same location, the flow will still be pushed pretty hard and probably separate. Another way to solve this problem is to then reduce the camber and increase the thickness. That will work better, but then requires a new wing. The third is to pitch the wing up more. Here that will align the top surface with the flow more, and reduce how much the flow will want to separate over it. While that will work, it will also probably reduce the downforce. Another way is to potentially drive faster. That's always good. But here it's also good because you then give the flow more energy to stay attached. But to see if that's a viable option, we actually ran the simulation at double the speed, so 144 kph. We have a few snapshots of the flow behind the wing, and unfortunately the flow is still separating here, and pretty similarly too. So even doubling the flow speed is nowhere near enough to solve this problem yet. At this rate, you might need to break the speed of sound to get the flow to stay attached, and then at that point, you might get shock-induced separation anyway, so you're back to square one. So all these potential fixes don't really work here. What we really have to do is somehow give the flow close to the surface enough energy so it stays attached, but is still easy for us to do. For that, we need to make the boundary layer turbulent. To do that, we can either use some kind of vortex generator again, or something called a boundary layer trip, for example zigzag tape. If you were to use vortex generators, then the same guidelines we talked about earlier for the diffuser are also applicable here. In a nutshell, put counter-rotating ones just before the maximum thickness point and try to make them around 1/3 of the boundary layer height. Alternatively, zigzag tape is great because it's much easier to use and install. Going that route, you literally just stick it about 5% back from the leading edge, and from wingtip to wingtip usually, but it depends on the flow separation characteristic. The way zigzag tape works, and any other boundary layer trip really, is that it creates strong disturbances that then trigger the flow close to the surface to become chaotic. While that might not sound great, what's actually happening is the flow close to the surface is now faster. That's good because it can push forwards more and stay attached. But everything we've talked about so far is just in the center plane. Let's jump over 0.6 meters to the left to see how the wing performs there. Interestingly, the flow underneath is now attached here. So in the center plane, the flow was separating. 0.6 meters to the left now, the flow underneath is great. What is happening though? It might be tempting to say that the wingtip vortex is rolling down underneath and squashing the flow up to the underside, but I think there's more to it than that. That's because this wing has end plates, so the wingtip vortex is going to be weaker, and looking at the streamline orbit, we see another major effect. So look at the streamlines going around the rear edge of the car, the C-pillar. They shoot underneath the wing at around this location, and they're now injecting the underside of the wing with more energy. It's kind of like running a race, almost passing out, then eating a pizza, and getting a boost of energy. So the wing is now doing awesome. That tells us that really only the middle part of the wing is performing poorly. And that's because it doesn't have any high energy flow being injected to where it needs it. So the question then becomes, how much of the rear wing should we have these vortex generators or zigzag tape over? Well, this plane, which is just below it, shows the middle section. Maybe 10 or 20 centimeters in either side is good. That's where we get this wake. These simulations were done with OpenFoam. If you want to learn OpenFoam, then check out our courses here. So those are the local effects of these modifications. Let's now look at the global effects to see how these mods affect the flow away from them. This plane is 0.6 meters off the ground, so 2 feet. I'm quite surprised with the flow on the front wheel. It's pretty good. And that surprises me because the front splitter and even the canards on the side are messing with the flow a lot. And yet, the flow on the front edge is good. In a way, it kind of acts almost like an air curtain because it speeds up so much, and so it shoots around the side faster. I also really like the rear edge. There's a fairly prominent rear wheel house, but the flow still stays attached around it and the rear edge. We've seen with a lot of cars how the flow separates around the rear edge, blows out, and creates a much larger wake and hence drag. Here, even with the wheel house, it doesn't do that. That's impressive. As a result, the Audi enjoys a lower drag because of it. The same is true higher up at 0.9 meters off the ground. There's not only no wake along the entire car, but the rear flow just zips in and there's almost no wake in general. That's really impressive here. And one reason why the TT has such an impressive wake here is because the rear wing is mounted fairly high. We'll talk more about that in a sec, but just here, mounting the rear wing above the trunk allows high-speed flow to race down the rear window and shoot into the wake. An alternative approach that many cars have is putting a rear spoiler on the back, so that little lip that just flicks up. For how small they are very potent. But it also increases the wake size because the flow over the rear is kicked up. The rear wing doesn't do that, and if designed well, it won't have much of a wake either. Unfortunately here, we do know that some of the rear wing is stalling, so a large wake is formed behind it. Now I said that this rear wing is mounted high. It's pretty high, but not quite high enough. Looking back to the center plane, you can see how the flow hitting the rear wing is greeny yellow. That's fine, that's quite fast, but if you mount it just a few centimeters higher, you'll get into even faster flow. That will then make the wing create more downforce because downforce produced is proportional to the velocity squared. What that means is that a little bit of an increase in the speed has a large effect on the downforce. Also, I should say that this is not just valid for this speed, because doubling the speed, we got the exact same thing. So mounting the wing higher is what you need to do. Speaking of mounts, in this plane, which is 105 centimeters off the ground, they're not great. There are large wakes from either one of them, and then the wake from the flow separating underneath the wing. This is one thing that many mounts don't get right. You can see that they are straight, but the flow hitting them is at an angle. That's because the flow wraps around the rear edges and flows slightly inwards. They then hit the mounts at an angle, and because the mounts are just sharp edges, the flow separates around them and creates wakes and drag. This is particularly noticeable near the mounting points of the wing. On top of the wing, the swan neck mounts wrap over and have these little plates. From an aeronautical point of view, they're cool, they're like little wing fences, so that's awesome. But in this plane, which is 1.13 meters off the ground, they're fine. They're in line with the flow enough to not have flow separation around them. As for the aerodynamic effects though, they're actually really impressive. So this velocity video doesn't show it much, but in the pressure video, we now see how awesome they are. Look at how much redder the flow is just inside the mounts, the wing fences, compared to outside. In other words, there's higher pressure in the middle section than on the outsides. That's because of the wing fences. While this wing does have end plates, which is great, no end plate is perfect though, unless you go to extreme versions like box wings for example. So some wingtip vortices will still form. That means that the flow over the pressure surface, so here, the top surface, is going to curve towards the wing tips. As it does that, it loses high pressure and becomes slightly lower pressure. That then migrates over the rest of the surface and the entire surface is affected. Here, the wing fences segregate those outer flows from the inner flow. The inner flow can then maintain a higher pressure because of that, and that then increases the downforce. So swan neck mounts are having a really cool effect here, and you don't see that every day. So while these modifications have some great points, they have some bad ones too. But the good news is that many of them can be fixed quite easily. So the drag coefficient, which is 0.34, can be dropped a little, and the downforce, which is currently minus 3.3 kilos, could be improved too. If you're staying on YouTube, it thinks you'll like this video, so check it out. Peace out, amigos.